In my quiet town, you wouldn't expect much in the way of anything interesting about it. There are homes, stores, a library, the usual places you'd find in a small town, but there are also abandoned and dilapidated houses. And in one of those buildings, there lived a truly evil man. His name was Ryan Burrow, but he was locally known as the Demon Butcher. He used to be a butcher in the 20s, and his store was always busy. With the money he made, he was living close to luxury. That was until the Great Depression. His store saw less and less business, and his bills grew higher and higher. With the debts deepening and mouths to feed, Mr. Burrow could not find any way of making money. But one night, after winning a game of poker, he was walking home, passing his store, when one of the men followed him and accused him of cheating and demanded his money back. Burrow and the man fought, but Burrow picked up a broken bottle from nearby and stabbed the man in the neck until he was covered in blood and the man stopped moving. Panicking, Burrow carried the body into his store and placed him next to the blood drain and paced the room. He felt sorrow for killing the man, but also felt a thrill from the murder. He tried to think of a way to get rid of the body, but stared at the corpse. Feeling a weird sort of calm, Burrow picked the body up and placed it onto a meat hook. He went to his bench and took his meat cleaver out of its slot. He walked over to the body and began cutting it apart. He began with the arms, then the legs, then the torso. Guts slithered out of the body and plopped with a wet slap to the floor. When he was done, he separated the meat from the bones and placed the meat onto metal trays and salted them for longer preservation. Burrow placed the trays under his display case and tried to figure out how to discard the bones and entrails. Burrow took the clothes and burned them. He then took the entrails and used them to make offal and ground beef. The bones he broke apart and placed in a box that he marked as bone disposal, and brought the box down to his small cellar and placed it in a corner. He went home and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. He kept thinking of what he'd do if someone found out. The next morning, Burrow went to his store and placed a sign on his window advertising cheap meat for a limited time only. At first, a trickle of people came and bought the meat, but after a short time, his store was soon flooded with desperate patrons wanting meat for their starving families. When he closed that day, he realized that he made a great profit. He began thinking of different ways of making money to avoid killing again, but his thrill for murder took control, and the next day, Burrow placed the same sign up on his door and had more meat to sell. This continued for a few months, and Burrow paid off his debts and began spending money on improvements of his store. He felt as if nothing could get in his way, but there was one problem. The police were receiving more and more missing persons reports and issued a curfew on the town, making it harder and harder for him to get more inventory, so he resorted to killing and harvesting in his victims' homes. After the first, the town was buzzing with the mutilated corpse found, and a manhunt was on for this gruesome murderer. Eventually, the police put two and two together and realized that the killer was Burrow. When they arrived on scene, Burrow's butcher store was just starting to light. The flames consumed the store, and an unhinged, hysterical laughter was heard as Burrow burned alive. When the fire died down, the smell of overcooked meat filled the air. Burrow's body was found slumped over his counter and charred black, with his meat cleaver warped and burned into the backbone claw of the corpse. From that day onwards, the Demon Butcher was a local staple on the town's history. The legend is that Burrow still haunts the streets, looking for his next victim. When I first heard it, I believed that it was nothing but lies to make sure children were inside before sundown. But after what I experienced, I can verify that the legend is very much real, and I have the scars to prove it. It happened almost 2 years ago. On a rather boring Friday evening, my friends Joey, Matt, and Rose called over to my place to hang out in my room. We took turns playing on my PlayStation and talking about anything that had happened to us since we last met that day. During a period of silence among us, Matt's head rose from its slouched position, and he gave an eerie grin. We looked between ourselves and asked if he was alright. His grin turned itself into a smirk, and he said, "How about we go out and do some breaking and entering?" We all shot back in surprise. "What the hell, Matt?" Rose said. "Are you seriously asking if we want to break into someone's house and risk prison time because we're bored?" Joey said, annoyance blatant in his voice. "No," Matt said. "I'm saying we get into an abandoned building and search it." I shook my head inside. That's trespassing and possibly looting, Matt. I look at him. Why? Where do you plan on going to? He looked at us and said, I don't know about you guys, but I'm going into the Demon Butcher's store. We looked at each other as Matt began to stand. Well, are you guys coming with me or not? Matt asked. The first of us to stand after a few moments of silence and contemplation was Joey, then Rose, then me. I grabbed my jacket on the way out of my house and slipped it on as cold air blasted us as we stepped out of my warm house and into the darkening street. Okay, if we hurry and stay quiet as we get in, we shouldn't be spotted, Matt said as he led us down the street and towards the shell of the store. After nearly 15 minutes of walking, we turned the corner and we faced our destination. The area where the store remained was generally abandoned and left as a landmark for our town's darkest time. The building itself was left to be overtaken by nature and in disrepair, as weeds grew higher around it and the bricks of the storefront were deteriorating with every year that passed. The weeds parted as we got closer to the storefront. After we looked up and down the street to make sure we weren't being watched, we kicked a hole in the board that blocked the door frame, and we crawled into the remains of the building. The smell of mold and mildew was strong as we brushed the dirt and wood splinters off of our clothes and knees. Rose and Joey gagged at the smell as myself and Matt looked around the interior. The roof was still black from the flames and had mostly collapsed. This allowed the year's worth of rain to ruin the interior of the building and cause big patches of black mold to grow on most of the walls and flooring. The mold made it seem like the interior was still charred from the fire of all those years ago. After Joey and Rose finished, we covered our faces with our shirts to stop the worst of the smell and spores from getting into our bodies, and we began looking around. When we found nothing but mold and rusted trays, we moved to the meat locker. When we passed through the open doorway, we were disappointed to not find any meat left hanging, but we still looked around. Burrow had extended his store so he could have extra room for storage, and more workspace, so we found dozens of empty hooks and extended lines for draining the blood outside. Jesus, Matt said as he tapped one of the hooks, causing it to swing back and forth. This is so messed up, Rose said, as she stared at one of the drains. Suddenly, Joey calls to us. Guys, come over here. I found the door to the basement. We looked over and see him standing above a double-door hatch. We approached slowly and stood beside him, waiting for one of us to reach down and attempt to open it. I decided to do it and reached a shaky hand down to a handle. The handle was cold and the sensation ran up my arm and into my spine. I gave the handle an overestimated pull and I fell backwards as one of the hatch doors opened easily and I landed on my back. As I stared up at the decaying ceiling, a hand grabbed mine and lifted me back onto my feet. Joey patted me on the shoulder and chuckled while saying, At least we know it's open now. I joined back with Matt and Rose as we each stared into the inky darkness below. We looked at each other, daring the other to take the first step, until Rose took her phone from her pocket and turned on the flashlight app. Are we just going to admire it or are we going down? She asked us as she put her foot on the first step and was beginning to descend the stairs. She took 2 more steps down the stairs before she suddenly screamed and fell into the darkness, and all we could see was her light bouncing after her until it landed and disappeared. Rose? We shouted in unison, and we quickly approached the stairs. I dug out my phone, as did the others, and turned on the flashlight as we ran down the steps and into the basement. When we reached the basement floor, we all shone our lights ahead of us, illuminating Rose's still form. We ran over to her to see if she was okay and squatted beside her. Rose raised her head and said, I'm okay. My shoe caught on one of those gaps between the steps. I looked behind me and saw her phone lying screened down on the ground. I picked it up and pressed the power button. The screen lit up, but there was a crack running from the top left to bottom left of the screen. Here's your phone. You might need to get it fixed, though, I said as I handed her the phone. She stared at the screen as she sat up. Shit, my parents are going to kill me. She said as we helped her to her feet. We all laughed, not because she was joking, but because she could have died, and only cared that her phone screen was cracked. We shone our lights around the basement. Down there were old crates and boxes scattered around, and bundles of old newspapers stained brown were stacked in near pile around too. As we looked around, a sound from upstairs caused us all to stand still. The sound was of heavy footsteps stomping around the meat locker. We turned our lights off and scattered around to try and find places to hide from this unknown person, believing it to be the police. I hid with Rose behind a crate and a tower of newspaper while Matt hid inside of a large box, and Joey tucked himself under the stairs, using newspapers to cover himself. The stomping reached the top of the hatch, and I heard slow but loud footsteps descend the stairs, but the remaining light from outside was extinguished as the person closed the hatch behind them when they began to descend. I heard when the footsteps reached the floor and they stopped. I could hear a heavy breath coming from the bottom of the stairs, and the footsteps began again, but they sounded quiet and more deliberate. I listened for the footsteps to get closer, but they went towards Matt's direction. I was just about to yell out for us to run when I heard a loud crash and Matt screaming. I turned my flashlight back on and shone it towards Matt. What I saw shocked me. Even to this day, I can't believe that it happened. Where the light shone, I saw a large, burly man in a white butcher uniform and an old, brown leather mask that covered the top half of his face. But the visible part of his face was charred black and parts of the jawbone were visible under the dark flesh. When the light shone on him, he was holding Matt by the throat and had just held a large cleaver under Matt's chin. The one visible eye in the mask was blood red, and the skin around what was left of a mouth moved to form what seemed like a smile. He held that smile as he dragged the cleaver across Matt's throat, and I felt a warm spray of liquid as Matt's twitches and jerked, and he tried to grab at the wide-eyed red smile carved into his throat. Rose screamed, but I, under some form of primal instinct, grabbed her hand and began to run towards the stairs. As we ran, I heard Joey scramble to his feet and we saw him appear from behind the stairs. Rose and I ran up the stairs and Joey followed, but we could hear the man's footsteps pound up the steps behind us. When I reached the top step and turned around, Rose passed me, but as Joey reached the top step, a large hand wrapped itself around Joey's ankle, and I saw Joey fall and land flat in front of me. He screamed and reached out his hand for me to take, but before I could, he was quickly dragged back down the steps and disappeared from sight. I took a step forward, but I heard a loud thud, and the heavy footsteps began again. I, reluctantly, turned and followed Rose through the meat locker and towards the front door. As Rose dived into the hole we created earlier, I turned and saw the man standing in the doorway to the meat locker. "There's no point in running, little man." A raspy and stained voice came from him. "I know this area, changed or not, and I can outrun you. There is no point in trying to get to safety because there is none. When I get my hands on you, I will gut you and leave you hanging on those hooks behind me," he said as he raised the cleaver and charged towards me. I turned from him and drove through the hole, possibly getting scratched to hell by the sharp points of the splintered wood, and scrambled to my feet to run with Rose. We had just passed the edge of the building when a massive crash came from behind us. I turned my head slightly and saw the butcher standing in the debris of the previously covered doorway. I looked away and tried to go full sprint away, but I felt a heavy object smash into the back of my shoulder, and pain erupted from that area. I trembled and fell with a cry. I felt a sharp pain as I landed flat on my stomach and smashed my chin against the road. Rose stopped to try and help me, but I shouted at her to keep going. She hesitantly resumed running, and I tried to turn around to face the butcher, but I felt his boot stomp into my back, and I felt him grasp the object that had embedded itself into my shoulder, and I screamed as he freed it from my shoulder. I turned my head toward the butcher, and I saw that he was standing over me, a bloody cleaver in hand, and he stared at me with his one evil eye with a smile that showed his black teeth. "Now I have you," he said as he raised the cleaver over his head to deliver the killing strike. Suddenly, a car engine approached quickly, and I heard sirens blaring as I looked behind me and saw a police car barreling towards us. The butcher growled in anger and turned away from me. He ran towards the store but disappeared in a cloud of black smoke that enveloped him. Though the lights drew closer to me, the sirens were fading, due to the large amount of blood pouring from the wound on my shoulder. Just before I blacked out, I heard the car door open, and Rose screamed my name. It turned out that someone at the end of the street saw us break in and called the police. When Rose ran to the end of the street, she saw the police car coming down the street and flagged it down. She explained to the officer that someone was trying to kill her, and that I was being attacked at the moment. When they arrived, the officer saw me, but no one else. An ambulance was called and I was brought for emergency surgery because I lost so much blood on the scene. I was in the hospital for a week before they released me. Rose visited me nearly every day. She was the one to tell me that they found Matt and Joey's bodies in the basement, and they were missing pieces of their bodies. The report was left as a maniac, pretending to be the demon butcher, had attacked us and fled from the scene when they saw the police car. Rose and I thought about giving our true statements, but we knew we'd be called crazy and wouldn't be taken seriously, so we went with the crazed maniac story. We attended Matt and Joey's funerals, and after a few years, we left that town behind. Rose went to New York, but I went to Texas. We keep in touch, but not as often as we used to. Ever since then, I hear footsteps. Even when all is silent, I hear them. As I'm sitting here typing this, my house is quiet, but in that silence, I can hear faint footsteps coming down the hall. Seeing as I live alone, this should raise alarm. The footsteps are either the echoes of my past that have returned to haunt me, or the butcher has come to claim me like he did my friends. Either way, I'm not worried. I've grown tired of the always present paranoia that I have endured since that day, and if it is the butcher, I am willing to welcome him and give my soul the rest it desires. I just heard banging on the door. It's time to end my nightmare. It's time to meet my maker. It's time to face the butcher. And I am not afraid.